This lecture will focus on the economic effects of the Black Death. And I gotta say, the material in this lecture is pretty cool because there are really big effects that we can describe. But it would probably be more fun if we weren't, living through a pandemic. Anyway, the disease that we're talking about is commonly called plague. We will talk about its causes and symptoms, and we'll talk about the economic effects that it must have had on the economy, given how devastating it was. So what we'll talk about is what the effects broadly were, and who might have benefited, and who was probably hit worst. One thing that I want to point out is that we've already talked about plague before. We know that plague had long-lasting effects on the price of British labor. We talked about that when we talked about Allen and the causes of the Industrial Revolution. So this has been somewhat haunting our discussion already. I'm going to focus the conversation of economic effects on two really important papers describing the Black Death. One by Voigtlander and Voth on the Three Horsemen of Prosperity, and also a really neat paper by Cummins, Kelly, and O'Grada on how the plague shaped out in London. And this paper you've had to read for this week. So first, a little bit about the disease. So we colloquially call this disease plague. What we're really describing is a disease caused by a particular bacterium called Yersinia pestis. And this is named after Alexander Yersin of Switzerland, who isolated the bacterium in 1899, actually at the same time as a Japanese researcher. But he gets the credit. Why pestis is one way to refer to this disease. What we seem to know now is that it's actually spread by a particular flea, which hitches a ride on small animals like rodents, especially rats. We also know that this disease possibly, maybe even probably, was able to be spread from person to person based on how quickly it was able to spread in certain times in history. But, this may surprise you. It's pretty unclear, actually, whether that's true. For a long time, what was confusing about plague is that it can cause three really distinct illnesses. And a lot of people, for a very long time, of course, didn't know that these were all caused by the same bacterium. So these three illnesses, which you may have heard of, are pneumonic plague, septicemic plague, and bubonic plague. So pneumonic plague, causes basically pneumonia. So it causes symptoms like fever, headache, cough, and trouble breathing. You've almost certainly heard of bubonic plague, which is a version of plague that causes basically flu-like symptoms, and also swollen lymph nodes, these horrible, ugly things that were called buboes. But the most deadly was actually septicemic plague, which causes a blood infection, and that then gets into your extremities and causes necrosis. It's very, very dying of your extremities. So it's very, very deadly. So you can imagine how confusing this would be to see three pretty distinct constellations of symptoms that in the end were all caused by the same bacterium. And also, if you want to sleep at night maybe a little better, it's important to know that these diseases, while almost certainly fatal without treatment, can be treated pretty effectively with modern antibiotics. By the way, plague is still around. Don't go cuddling armadillos in the American Southwest, for example. You can catch plague. I guess it's at least helpful to know that if you do catch it, there's antibiotics for you, but you have to know what's making you sick. I think there's an episode of House about this, maybe. Anyway. Throughout history, several major epidemics and pandemics, or plagues, have been caused by this single bacterium, Yersinia pestis. So, for example, we talked about the plague of Justinian in the last set of lecture notes, which happened roughly, remember, about 540 AD, and killed about 50 million people. This is sometimes called the first pandemic of plague. The second pandemic of plague has really three episodes. The first one is most severe, and the second two are less severe. And so, by the way, this table comes right from Alfani and Murphy. So the plague or pandemic that we call Black Death happened from about 1347 to 1352. So that's not a huge amount of time, okay? And it was centered around Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. It may have actually come from Central Asia and also spread to parts of China and other places as well. And it killed up to about 50 million people, and that's just in Europe. so probably more elsewhere. This was a very devastating plague. There were also two other waves of plague that happened later. So one in the early 17th century in Central and Western Europe, and then another a little later that century, which I think I've heard of more often, right? That happened around the Spanish Mediterranean and also Italy. They killed, about 1.24 million people. I know, like after Black Plague, you're like 1.24 million people, no big deal. Well, okay, remember, COVID-19 is a very big deal and has killed a little over 1 million people worldwide. So these are and out of a much larger world population. So these are very significant plagues, which are recorded well in the historical record. Now, let's take a step back and think broadly about what must have been the economic effects of plague. If we believe the world in this time was roughly Malthusian, we have a framework that allows us to organize our thoughts about what must happen. If plague kills a lot of people, in this framework, what that would correspond to is a dramatic movement of the death curve to the right, meaning that at all levels of the wage, we have more deaths. In equilibrium, what this would mean is that real wages would have increased. And in fact, this appears to be broadly true. We know that real wages did increase dramatically following the Black Death. We know that in England, based on research by Gregory Clark, wages probably doubled following 1350. Okay, this is not a small change. Furthermore, it seems that this wage increase was surprisingly permanent throughout much of Europe, and we know especially in England, which could have done its part in causing the Industrial Revolution. There's this really interesting paper. It's really controversial, but I'm going to teach it to you because it's kind of neat and fits so well in our discussion. There's this really neat paper by Nico Voigtlander and Hans-Joachim Voth called The Three Horsemen of Riches, Plague, War, and Urbanization in Early Modern Europe. This paper presents a theory of basically how Europe was able to escape the Malthusian trap, and plague plays a key role in this. So here's their hypothesis. Voigtlander and Voth argue that there's a mutually reinforcing effect of war, urbanization, and disease after the Black Death. And this interacting effect actually for a brief period of time and in a transitional manner created an upward sloping deaths curve. In other words, for at least some period of time, there was this mutually reinforcing effect wherein an increase in the real wage was associated with an increase in the deaths rate. This sounds crazy. Let me spell out how they think this might have happened. First, they highlight a tendency that we have already encountered in our Wrigley reading. So we know that there's a mutually reinforcing effect between real wages and urbanization that actually has a name that's called Engel's Law. So remember the way this works. People that have higher real wages don't have to spend as high a proportion of their total income on food, so they're able to buy secondary and tertiary goods, which are commonly produced in cities rather than in the countryside. So, if the Black Death led to higher incomes, that can lead to increased urbanization. But the thing about European cities is, remember, they are disgusting. You go there to die. So this increased urbanization would have then led to itself higher death rates, which could lead to higher incomes, which could lead to higher urbanization, which could lead to higher death rates, which can lead you get the picture, right? There's already this mutually reinforcing loop, which is made possible because European cities are gross and kill you. Furthermore, higher incomes from the Black Death meant that there is more surplus to be captured. There's money around. This means there is money to fight over, and this causes more warfare. And the thing about war in this period is actually the violence of war was not particularly deadly or destructive. But what war does, as we've encountered in the Roman cases, is war spreads disease. And that in itself reinforces the higher death rates. So what you have, right, is this mutually reinforcing system of the Black Death causes higher wages, which causes urbanization and war, which themselves can increase wages and cause higher death rates. So what you get altogether, therefore, is a really weird-looking Malthusian diagram, okay? On the left-hand side, we have that our right-hand panel as we're used to seeing it. Okay, we have births and deaths and a relationship with the wage. They've just switched the axis here, but it's still the same picture. Now look on the right side where they have the steady states of this model, but with a so-called Horseman effect. So at E0, we're at sort of our starting point equilibrium where we expect to be. But when the Black Death strikes, we end up with this upward sloping correspondence between the death rate and the wage. But this is really an unstable situation. And with a little boost, okay, in the wage or in the death rate, we can move to this new steady state equilibrium, EH, which gives us a new equilibrium at a higher level of the wage and a higher birth and death rate. So that is the Horseman effect. And that's how a shock like the Black Death could have led to overall higher levels of wealth and income in Europe. It's a really controversial story. The way that they make this argument is by presenting a lot of kind of stylized facts and well-known statistics. So for example, here, like we have maps, we have like graphs here of plague outbreaks in Europe, and also a really convincing diagram showing you how dramatically life expectancy in early modern England changed. But the rest of the argument is based on a model which they calibrate. And so you believe the result and the mechanism, as much as you believe that the model and the way they fit the model corresponds to reality. So that's some of the nature of the controversy about this paper. If you're interested in seeing what a paper like this looks like, I definitely recommend that you check it out. One, I think, really interesting note that comes out of this paper is an insight, again, about, why wasn't China the place that ended up diverging from the rest of the pack and becoming very wealthy early on? Why was it Europe? It's actually not obvious, okay, that it shouldn't have been China. So we have one theory due to Joel Mokyr who says that the thing about China was that they almost did too well. They were so prosperous and so peaceful that there was no impetus to keep up in terms of invention and innovation. So Mokyr's whole story is about innovation and why people innovate or not. And so that's his theory about why China didn't take the lead. But Voigtlander and Voth point out a kind of separate mechanism that's really interesting. The problem with China, in terms of this story, is that their cities were not disgusting and did not kill you. Chinese cities had really effective methods of disposing of waste, and people in these cities tended to have more vegetarian diets, which are also less gross in terms of waste disposal. So that breaks the Horseman effect, essentially, in this model. And furthermore, China, again, has this long period of peace. There aren't wars spreading disease. So that breaks the other fork of that path as well. So that's, I think, a really interesting story of why we have a divergence in Europe, but not in China. I've asked you to read a really interesting paper by Cummins, Kelly, and O'Grada that provides some evidence on who the plague tended to affect more. They've written this really interesting paper about how, especially the later plagues, affected people in London. And what they've done, which is really cool, is they have digitized records from Ancestry.com that give us causes of death of people and death rates, especially for this later period from 1560 to 1665. From this new data, they're able to perform a variety of standard statistical exercises and also give us some really cool maps that give us some sense of what's going on. So one of the most important parts of this paper is that they've argued that the plague, when you actually map it out, was not concentrated in the docks, where you might have expected to see it due to worldwide trade. Actually, what's going on is that the area by the docks was relatively wealthy, and people were able to spread out and actually physically distance, and the area there was actually cleaner, so there wasn't much spread of plague. However, in the poor northern suburbs, people were very concentrated together. There was probably a higher rodent population and dirtier conditions, and the plague spread like wildfire there. And you can see this from some of their key maps. So what you see here is the darker areas of London here are places where there was more mortality due to plague. And so I don't know if you guys are super familiar with the geography of London, but this is the Thames River, okay? And the dock area is this part sort of cordoned off with a black line. And what you can see is that there's actually, not a whole lot going on there, especially in the later plague. But there's a lot of mortality in the north. So what has happened here is that even in this earlier period, without the benefit of a lot of knowledge of science, the areas closer to the docks were able to clean up a lot. Okay, and we're able to figure out that if you separate people and you get rid of the rodent population, you're going to have less plague. But that was not possible in the poorer northern suburbs. Right, and you can see this even more strikingly as time goes on, right? This just continues, that the northern suburbs are totally deadly and the areas by the docks are not so bad. Okay, so this is a way, and this I think sounds pretty familiar to us now, that in places where people have relatively less income and are more concentrated together, diseases like plague can spread much more rapidly. So let me just here summarize and say that, look, there's actually a huge literature on the economic effects of plague. It's one of the most important episodes in human history. So, of course, there's been a lot written about it. And here I've only scratched the surface by presenting to you two really influential papers on the economic history of plague. This is our first case where we might have encountered a kind of silver lining here. Remember that the plague probably dramatically increased wages in Europe and might have had a long-run positive effect on economic development in Europe. But remember, it's only good if you survive it, and the effects of this are not going to be borne equally.